G'day there. You're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today I've got a video that looks at quite a popularly requested topic, which is how to obtain quantities and ultimately eventually costs from a Revit model. I'm going to show you a strategy that I use at most project scales, which helps Revit understand the way that we want to measure particular objects. The focus here is to inform a workflow in a second part where we're going to use Dynamo in order to extract these quantities in a predictable manner. Because the problem with Revit is a lot of things come with a lot of quantities available, and usually we really only want to target one or maybe two types of quantities for a particular object. For example, a wall can have a volume, a length, and an area, when usually we probably want to just target the area. Now, of course, also it's worth considering that quantity takeoff in Revit is quite a difficult topic because often as architects, we're not modeling very accurately. So I do have to disclaim that even if you follow this workflow I show you, of course the accuracy of your model is going to be the driver for how successful this workflow can be applied. However, I have worked with a variety of clients and used similar methods in order to help them really accurately measure their models, as long as they model well. Anyway, today I'm just going to be using the Revit basic sample project. It's nothing amazing, but in this case it represents a good blank slate that we can work with. And we're going to introduce some cost rates, and I'll also show you some automation tools you can use to pre-populate or enter some cost data in those elements. So let's jump in. So we're going to begin by using the Autodesk basic sample project. Now, it's not the best project. It does have a lot of issues with it, a lot of data issues, and whilst I have made a remake of this project and it's free over on my course platform, I prefer to work with a more generic model in this case because it does highlight some of the challenges of working with a messy model. So the first thing to be aware of is that the data isn't the greatest in the model. Often the naming of things might not be consistent. For example, we do have some information about this particular wall, but if I do keep looking around the model, eventually I'll come across things with just a code and typically no description. So the first thing you probably are going to want to do is go around the model and apply good descriptions and good coding to your objects where you can. And in fact, I am going to do that. I'm not going to show every single step because it is quite boring. But what I would typically be doing by the time I come back is, in this case, let's say this wall here is really to me a concrete wall. It's sort of retaining as well. So I usually would like to check, where it's being used. In this case, it's used in quite a lot of places, and it usually looks to be a retaining wall of sorts. So I'm typically going to be looking to do things such as give a better name to this. Now it looks like it has a code in this case. I'm just going to, in this case, call this concrete retaining wall. And I'll just call it, in this case, it's actually 280 mil. So I'm going to call it 280. And usually you might want to also come down here and give it a good description because we are going to want to use this data. And it's up to you if you want to give it something like a keynote or something more meaningful. In this case, I might just leave the keynotes as they are and rely mostly on description. But I am going to do a little bit of a time jump. If you do want to get the model in the updated state, it will be available on my GitHub. But otherwise, just have a look around the model, trying to clean up things that are typically not going to be easy to identify if you can't see them visually in Revit. So I'll see you shortly. Okay, so I've just finished updating the model. Now there's a lot of issues with it. Having said what I've seen, it's definitely not the cleanest model. I realized I haven't updated the windows, so I'll just quickly do that. Now I've really mostly just been going around and simplifying or updating or adding a description to every object that I believe should be involved in cost takeoff. So for example, this skylight, you can see it has no description. But now everything does. I did also make quite a lot of changes to categorization. So for example, there was a range hood enclosure that I moved to the specialty equipment, which is usually where I put appliances. Same with the TV as well. Also, there was some furniture system objects that I moved in this case to casework. So it's often important to think about consistent categorization of objects in Revit if you wish to use this data to sort your data outside of Revit as well. I often do recommend trying to build a consistent standard and sticking to it. So the next step in this case is we're going to have to add some more data to classify or tell these objects how they should be measured. Because currently, if we look at, say, this wall, for example, it has many ways it could be measured. It has a length, an area, a volume. Now, really, most of the time, the face area is probably the best way to measure an object, assuming it's been modeled accurately to its face area. So in this case, we're going to add a new parameter, which we're going to use to inform this object that it should be measured on that basis. So if I go to Manage, Project Parameters, and I add a new parameter. Now I could add a shared parameter or a project parameter. Usually I would use a shared parameter, So what we might do is actually just create one. So I'm going to make a new shared parameter file, and I'm going to add a new group to that file, and I'll just call this working. We're just testing some things. The first parameter we want to add in this case is going to be the cost rate. So how are we actually measuring the object, or the takeoff rate, I should say. So I'm just going to give this a prefix, APG underscore takeoff rate. And I'm going to make this a text-based parameter. Notice I usually use, in this case, I believe this is called Pascal case, where you capitalize where you wish to break your data, and I usually use an underscore for a big data break. I'm also going to add another parameter. This one I'm going to call ABG costs itemized. And we're going to use Dynamo later on to actually return a cost, in this case, to this particular object. I'm going to make it of the data type currency. So we are going to use Dynamo to actually calculate each object's inherent cost and write it back to Revit before we extract that data out using Dynamo as well. The cost parameter that already exists in Revit, we're going to use as the unit cost, or the per the rate. So for example, if we have a floor, its meter squared cost will be its cost factor in this case. The last thing we'll do is just we'll add a cost group, because we want to break down these objects into logical sets of objects that we can then compare on a group basis. So for example, if I just want to look at the planting or the landscaping, or I just want to look at the facade, I can isolate them using cost groups. Now you could use a classification system and assembly codes. That's another way that larger projects usually manage this. I just want to keep things simple for this demonstration. And in this case, I'm going to add these to pretty much everything that will support them on instance basis. So for the cost group, I'm actually going to do it per type basis. I'm just going to select everything, and I'm just going to come down to a few of these subcategories just to see if they're selected. So in this case, railings, I'm going to pick handrails and top rails. Roofing, I'm going to pick fascias, gutters, and soffits. I believe that's probably all that I need to select in this case. Yep, that's fine. So keep in mind that when you do a select all, it's not actually going to pick those things inside the tree. A little bit annoying, but just the way that it does work. So I'm going to OK that. Now we've added the new parameter. I'm going to get rid of these two default parameters that we're not using. And I'm going to do the same in this case for the cost itemized, but this one I'm going to do on an instance basis, because we want each object to have a unique populatable cost. And this is how much that actual object will cost. So I'm going to do check all, and in this case I'm just going to find anything that I know typically is going to have nested groups that we want to apply costs to on an individual basis. So handrails and rails, fascias, gutters, and soffits, and I believe that's all we need. Yep. And finally, I'm just also going to add, in this case, that takeoff rate on a type basis to all applicable objects I can find. So again, I believe that's just railings and roofs. Now, if I have a look at one of these objects, for example, this wall, I'll find that first of all, we should have introduced a new parameter which can be populated with an itemized cost later on, which we'll use a computation to do automatically. If I go to the type properties of this object, I should now have two additional parameters as well. First of all, for the cost group, it's up to you how you break it down. In this case, I'm going to pick a group called facade, and also the takeoff rate in this case is a wall, so we're going to pick the M2 rate. So typically I use M2 for area, or meters squared, LM for linear meters. Of course, you can just use length, or a term that doesn't imply a metric or an imperial measure. You can also use volume, or M3, and E or each for things that are measured on a one-off basis. So what I want to do at this point is get a data table that I can easily populate myself. So in this case, I am just going to go up to the View tab, Schedules and Quantities, and I am in Revit 2022, so the multi-category schedules do have a great deal of content available in them now. If you're in an earlier version, you might need to use some other category schedules for items that don't appear naturally in a multi-category schedule. In this case, I'm going to change my phase to the working drawing phase, so make sure you are looking at the correct phase of the project to see all the objects. And I'm also just going to be looking, first of all, for the item's family and type, and I might also get its category so I know exactly what I'm looking at. But I'm then also going to have a look at description to make sure that I have populated the descriptions properly. And I'm also going to be populating, in this case, the takeoff rate, the cost, which I might put before takeoff rate, and then the cost group. And in this case, I just want to see the types in this case. So I'm going to turn off itemize every instance, but I'm going to sort by family and type. And what we should get now is each row representing a particular category, object, and description. Now we can always sort by category, or we can even break out the category into a header and then put a blank line and then family and type. That way we can look at it category by category instead. I can quickly have a look and obviously populate these things myself if I so choose, but that wouldn't be a very effective method. I can see the data I've populated about my facade here and the fact it's an area takeoff, but I may also wish to tell it what it actually costs per square meter. So let's say this particular wall construction is $225 per square meter. Now it's going to change all those objects of that type. So if I do say okay, it's actually going to go to the type of that object instead. Notice at the moment I can't see the cost here as well, so I can always go to the formatting, pick my cost parameter, and in this case I can go to field format, turn off the project settings or modify my project settings, pick my currency, I can use digit grouping, I can choose no decimal places, and we'll see something that looks more like a currency at that point. Now I prefer to do most of this in a more capable program like Excel. There are many applications that will allow you to connect Excel and Revit. Some are free, some aren't. Today I'll be using one that's not free, but there are similar products out there by such developers as droots or BIM42. I'm going to be using ID8 BIMlink today, quite a well-known application for connecting Excel back and forth. So in this case, I'm going to go to BIMlink. And in this case, I want to get all these types out of the schedule that I've already set up for myself. So once it loads, we're going to create a new link and we're going to base it by schedule. And in this case, I'm just going to pick my multi-category schedule and I'm going to do this as a type link, which will allow me to actually modify type properties and view my data in types by rows. So if I go next, it's now going to set up the properties for me. I have a chance to modify things if I wish to, things I wish to exclude. But at this point, I'm quite happy with what I'm seeing. Now, there are other options like adding various filters and sorting properties, other properties to the schedule itself, but for now, I'm quite happy with this. Now, this can be quite handy if you do have shared parameters that Revit isn't letting you include that do belong to some of the objects in that particular schedule. Notice it's also adding ID. So it's going to take the element ID of the type out as well and use that as a means of matching that object back in Revit later. So this is a unique ID. I'm going to say done. And I'm going to take this multi-category schedule type export and I'm going to export this to just my desktop. And it will give me an option to open the file. So it's a really smooth tool, guides you through the process. Now notice at the moment I can't modify some properties like ID, category, family, and type, which makes sense. Some objects don't have parameters available and you'll see them sort of hashed out in this case. But typically I'm really only looking at items that I have given a valid description to. So the great thing about being in Excel is I can sort and filter, and I can add the filter, and I can say that in this case, I don't want anything that is blank. And now I'm just looking at a limited number of objects. I might just make these a little bit bigger. And I can start populating these objects. So let's say in this case, my kitchen benches cost $2,200 each. So I'll use EA as my takeoff rate. EA, and we know this data type is currency, so I might also tell this data type to be currency. And we can also add cost group. In this case, maybe we want to call this FFE. Or maybe we want to call it joinery, because it is fixed joinery, so it might be a more specific trade. And I'm just going to work my way through this whole list effectively. When I'm finished, I'll kick off the video again, and we'll reintroduce this data back to Revit. And then we'll be pretty much ready to proceed to the next part of the series, which will look at using Dynamo to actually run some calculations on this data and build a report. Okay, so I've now fully populated this data table. Now I have paid some key considerations in certain areas, especially thinking about the types of volume and area parameters that we're going to actually have to access. So when I've got some objects, for example, in this case, a structural floor, I've had to think, how do I actually want to measure this object? Is the meter squared rate appropriate? Is the volume rate appropriate? In this case, I'm saying volume, but you would have to be very careful that that actually is representative of the way that that element is modeled. For example, if your slab is modeled inaccurately, then of course the volume is going to be unreliable. So sometimes you may want to use a meter squared rate instead when you know a more nominal rate you can apply to the object. There are other things that I've just left out on purpose. For example, the pile rod is shared inside the pile cap, so I don't want to double cost this item. Likewise, curtain glazing as a wall is really just hosting curtain panels and mullions, which I've already nominated earlier on in my cost rates. So it's important to think about what you're actually measuring and to make sure you're not accidentally double measuring or measuring components that aren't appropriate for cost takeoff. So now that this table is ready for reintroduction to Revit, I'm going to save it, go back to Ideate BIMlink and import that table. And Ideate BIMlink will pick up all the changes that I've made and effectively tell me what's going to change, and then finally I can introduce the change at the end. So we can see all the changes we've made typically in yellow. In this case, usually just a cost, takeoff rate, and cost group. So at this point we can import, we can see we have no errors and warnings, which is great. And once I import, there it is. All my data that I wanted to introduce is now available in Revit for use in a future costing exercise using Dynamo. So I hope this has been a useful example of how I would usually add information to a model. I might quickly show you an example of another project that I've set up with some information already to show you what a cleaner model would often look like in this case. So I am just going to navigate to a specific project on my system. And I'm just going to upgrade it so you can see it. Now, not this one, sorry, that's the BSP, there we go. So this is my basic sample project reboot, which you can find over on my website at courses.bimguru.education for free. Effectively, it's my attempt at remaking this particular model with a higher degree of accuracy, reliability, and suitability. So you might wish to undertake this exercise with this particular model. I probably am going to update this model in future to support a full cost and quantity takeoff, because it is modeled much more accurately and in a way that lends itself towards quantity takeoff as well. So for example, I do model these stud walls separate to the facade, so you can actually cost both of them individually as separate systems. I model soffits, ceilings, etc. But having said that, I did want to use just a more generic model because it's a great example of a really messy and more typical type of model you might encounter out in the real world, as unfortunate as that usually is. So once this model does finally open and upgrade, I'll just quickly show you the types of things that I do recommend including in your data in most cases. So we can already see the model is much more accurate and detailed. I am modeling, the walls separately, interior to exterior, modeling things like wall finishes. So of course there's much more availability for data to cost. But if I have a look at this roof, for example, and I go to its type properties, I can see it's already got a clear code and name. It has descriptions, codes, but I've also integrated a classification system, a Uniclass 2015 classification system, which would probably enable better quality grouping of the objects in another program if you have pre-applied those types of parameters. I also have some IFC guidance data, but I also have classes to say what type of material the object belongs to. So is it metal, is it concrete, is it masonry, and also other properties such as is it concrete, is it fire rated, etc. But in this case, just having this information pre-populated, ready to go, does unlock a lot of great potential, and it also enables you to do just general quantity takeoff much more easily. For example, I've very easily generated a fixture schedule with consistent data from the model live, in this case not dealing with costs but just quantities of fixtures, and because all my fixtures have consistent data, in this case they all start with F dot for fixtures, I can very easily filter down the schedule, and because they all have good descriptions I can also see what those objects are and then group them by row. So sometimes you can find nice little opportunities if you just put that little bit of time into managing the data in your model. In the next video, we'll have a look at actually using this data in a more interesting workflow. So hopefully that was a useful video. Obviously what I'm showing you here is just one way to go about it. Now there are things like classification schemes you can use to apply to objects to better classify them in a larger scale project. So really I'm just doing a very informal classification here. However, I guess these are the steps you could use in order to set up an effective cost takeoff workflow. In the next video, I'm going to be looking at how you can use Dynamo to extract this data to an external format, but using these parameters we've set up as a guide for how Dynamo knows which parameters are relevant per the quantity that we want to obtain. Anyway, I hope you see me in that one, but if you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so, and I look forward to seeing you in the next part, as well as other future videos. Thanks. Take care. Bye.